So I'm in Stephen Wells' garden in Montmorency, Victoria, and I am and have always been in awe of this garden. Stephen's use of a really small space, we're talking about 350 square meters, but multiple spaces within that, is like, is exemplary. I can't think of anywhere in the world that does it as well as this. It is loaded with idea after idea for small gardens and how to confound your sense of space and how to make the best use of every square meter you've got. This house is now on the market, and so I was keen to get here before it's dismantled or whatever its future might be, and to extract some of the principles at play in this amazing property. So I think principle number one is to make sure your spaces, simple, but are flat, that they're level. And what Stephen has done here has created a series of level spaces out of what was, well, it is quite a sloping block. I am about 2 meters below another level space within this garden, within this 350 square meters. In fact, I'll take the camera off the sticks and show you a few of these spaces. This is the lowest space, and in fact, towering over me there is a subdivision of the space that goes up to nearly 4 meters tall, separating me from another space further up higher. But let's take a look at that in a second. Here's another space in here at approximately the same level, lower than the garden proper. Going up some stairs here and through into yet another space. Man, I love this space, it's so fantastic. And then swinging around through this little aperture here, yet another space with table and chairs. Then maybe I can do this all in one. We can swing round through here, run down the side. Cute little corner just here. And then this space down the side of the house with a bath, of course. And then out the front is the entrance space, which is itself really sweet, self-contained little space. Now, any one of those spaces could be entirely self-contained. One of those alone could be deeply satisfying in its own way. A little table and chairs, or a little fire pit, or dining table or cafe table, the one with the pod, the recessed seat. All of these spaces are really standalone. One good space is enough. In this case, there's, how many did we see? Maybe 6 amazing spaces within this 350 square meters, but they're flat. There's steps between them, but each one of them has to be flat. Sloping ground is really of no use to you. So for a start, it's a really simple thing, but in order to get the most out of your space, it needs to be flat. Okay, number one. 2, there's very, very effective subdivision of these spaces. They're separate. You are virtually unaware of the others when you are in any one of them. And in some cases, that has required the use of internal fencing and internal walls within the boundaries to create that separation of space. Stephen has been uncompromising in dividing this up. There could have been places where you could have got a greater sense of scale of the space by joining those up or creating a continuum, a continuous space, but instead it is very distinct little rectangles of space that are all quite separate and highlighted, often created by what appears to be fences within the boundaries. So let's go and have a look at those. This fence, for instance, looks like another building, and with that lovely effect of a courtyard created between 2 buildings, but it's not a building at all. That door is pretty much a fake, and even the reveal and the depth of it is just created by fake sides. But this is just a free floating fence, and where I was filming before, is down the other side of that. I'll see if you can get kind of an idea of how deep down. Oh, can you see down in there? Not really, but the garden extends on the other side of this fence. So it's completely unnecessary, but what it does is blocks a view beyond. So it does a lot of work, but it creates this really beautiful sense of like a little void between two buildings. And likewise, this incredible one through here with the pod in it, this one, what Stephen calls the pod, with this beautiful recessed seat, this is in a wall set 1 meter inside his boundary. So he created this tall fence / wall 1 meter inside his boundary because this got around his need for engineering and council permission. So he has a fence against his boundary, and then this one sits 1 meter inside the boundary and is tall enough to block out the view of a nearby property. But I mean, how fantastically enticing is that seat in the wall? Likewise, this bit of fencing, which is a reasonably recent addition, is in order to block a house beyond, a view of a house beyond. And it's just freestanding, as I'll show you the side of it. It's just sitting, right within the garden. The garden extends down there. But just this fantastic freestanding apparent fence, giving you the sense that this is the boundary, but it's not. There's this lovely aperture through. And seeing that aperture leads me to the next little principle at play here, and that is this idea of controlled glimpses through, of deliberate use of aperture, of squeezing through something quite narrow into something wider beyond to give you a greater sense of arrival, a greater sense of the division of the spaces. This is sometimes used just in window form. Sometimes it's a pure trick using mirror. More often than not, it's actually a gateway. But this sense of stepping through one space into another, going through a narrow opening into a widening, is a very powerful, has a very powerful kind of physical and psychological effect on us. And it's something that not enough home gardeners deliberately use. Let's take a look at those examples around the property. So I'm standing back in one of these spaces, and you can just see this little glimpse around to the right. Really interested that Stephen's got this panel in front there, against which this lamp swings, that he's deliberately withholding a view down into there to control where your eye goes. It's a fantastic little fun addition of a slide in there, running down into another space further down there with my video equipment, of course, getting in the way. But yeah, so you swing around through this opening here, and this gives you a whole sense of separation from this space beyond, which wouldn't have been there originally. Coming through here, and then swing around, we see what we saw before. This amazing gateway through to the other lower level, some steps that step down there. It's really odd that from multiple angles, you kind of feel like you're looking at a mirror. There's something about the framing of that makes you feel like it's a trick, but it's not. That is actually a space beyond. And then swinging around here, of course, the corner is essentially a space. You'll see a fake aperture here of a mirror set against the fence and at an angle, so I can stand here and not see myself back, which is further confounding, but a really lovely sense of a glimpse through, but through to nothing, in fact, because it's just a mirror. And then perhaps, to me, one of the most interesting decisions here, might swing down the other side and look back just so that we are avoiding the view of the bins. But it's a really long, narrow stretch down the side of the house. This is kind of everyone's problem, what to do with that long, narrow stretch down the side of the house. Do you just ditch it and go, well, it's not important? Or do you turn it into something usable? And this is what Stephen has done so well here. Love the fact that he's kind of decked it with these big, broad, treated pine timbers, but then hung this double set of doors, painted brightly, halfway down, not quite, somewhere near halfway, And what this does, by narrowing the space even further, it divides what would otherwise be an entirely linear space into two. And it makes it feel less linear as a consequence. And I think that's really important. I think it's a really genius move. Now, it's there partly to hide the bins, but it also has this amazing effect of dividing. How do I go back on that? That it's basically the longer and narrower a linear space is, really the less interesting it is. It just becomes a corridor, it just becomes a thoroughfare. And by dividing it up and turning it into what are more rectangular spaces, say like this one that the bath is in, it makes it a whole lot more interesting. I mean, you would not want to sit in that bath if all you were doing is sitting down in the middle of that long corridor. You know, it is the fact that that little tiny bit of return wall there feels like this is an individual standalone space of its own, and it's all done by narrowing what is already a narrow, long linear space even further. So apertures, so important, and such a great way of sort of confounding or controlling where your eye goes, and therefore being able to manage people's perception of the scale of the space. And then we get to absolutely my favorite principle, I guess, of making a contained space feel and appear larger. And this is the one that I think Steve just excels in. And I can't think of anywhere else in the world that better demonstrates this idea that when your boundaries are close, and they are in a 350 square meters property with a apartment in the middle of it, they're going to be close. How to confound the viewer's perception of where the boundaries actually are. And one of the great ways of doing this is to make sure that your eye cannot, or is thrown in resting on coming to its final resting place at the boundary, to create offsets in front of the boundary at whatever point your boundary needs to be solid because of a fence or otherwise, to offset, it can be very shallow, offset something in front of that solidity in a way that your eye kind of doesn't quite know where to come to rest, or it's prevented from just slamming into the solid wall. So let's go and have a look at the multiple ways that Steve has achieved that here. Well, we can start down on the terrace from which I'm speaking to you, and you see that this kind of diagonal wall, there's a mirror in there. I'll try and stand, you can see me in the mirror. There's a mirror there. Now the mirror is genius, there's mirrors all around this place, but that is the boundary back in on that diagonal timber where the mirror is. Sitting in front of that is the rusty wall with the big orange oval in it, and on the right hand side bamboo sitting in front of that, so that you've got this sort of multi-layered thing. You've got a pot in front of there, you've got all this other branching stuff, so that your eye can't kind of quite register which of those is the boundary, and it is interrupted so many times in its process of finding the boundary that it confuses your sense of where the boundary is. In this part of the garden, Steve's used these baskets, these rusty baskets. See if I can zoom in on it. You'll see these baskets hanging from on the actual wall, which is a freestanding piece of wall that he's created. And then all these plants, these are drought-tolerant plants, the bromeliads and chlorophytum, some asparagus fern, this kind of thing. But it just means that your eye kind of can't quite find, or doesn't without having, it's having to work to find where the actual wall is behind that. And this has this fantastic confounding effect. If I swing around on the wall I'm just stepping through that we saw before, likewise with this, there is this, that the pots just mean that you kind of can't quite focus on where the actual wall is. But possibly even more effective to me is few ideas around the side here. There's the mirror, amazing. But this, I think this is really interesting, this bit of mesh in here, just offset against, so right in there, you might be able to see where the actual fence is. In front of that is a panel, a freestanding panel, always with pots on top. In that freestanding panel, or on the back of that, somewhere near the back, is set some masonite painted just in a dark and receding colour. Then in front of that, there's mesh, and in front of, and growing on that is Muhlenbeckia. So your eye just doesn't know actually where on earth the boundary is in there. You know, this doesn't take up a lot of space. This is, the front of this is probably 300 mil off the actual boundary, but the effect, I'll zoom back, oh no, I've got to go back, don't I? There we go. You just lose this, you lose all perception of where the boundary actually is, and then that mirror, which is genius. But then on this side, I just think is equally clever and possibly more manageable for your average person to think of adapting, is this freestanding, almost like a wall unit. I'll try and get the sun at a better angle. Almost like a wall unit, offset from the fence. So the fence is, I'll zoom in a bit so that you can get a better sense of, it's offset by maybe 150 mil off the fence, but then sitting in this wall unit is this collection of pots, some candles, some succulents, a bit of a mirror down there. But all this does is just puts interruptions to your eye running straight to the boundary and finding it's the place it's forced to stop. So at no point does it feel like it's forced to stop. And this is just genius. Elsewhere, just down here, this is incredible. I just think this is amazing. So there's the boundary fence, the white wall in the back there. And in front of that, Steve has built a fence as if the fence is sitting, say, a foot proud, 300 mil, 250 mil proud of the actual boundary fence, and then has created, therefore, these kind of like what effectively is like a window box along the bottom, chlorophyton, and the native Viola heteracea. But again, this just sort of confounds your sense of, your eye rests against the forward fence, but then realizes there's some depth to this. And the fact that it's hollow above, let's have a look and see if I can show that. Well, it shows how the light can come down in that gap in a really amazing way. The plants kind of look lit like high lit. It's incredible, just an amazing array of ways of confounding your sense of where the boundary is. Even in these doors, look at this, there's these boxes inset with just various bits of paraphernalia and planting, but each of these again gives you something to look at in the foreground of the solidity of the background, so that I don't know whether it's that your eye just forgets to go to the background or something, but it is really powerful way of confounding your sense of the end point. If we go down further around here into the front garden, even on Steve's front gate here, this is the actual gate with these fabulous circular planters, and this really shallow, this setback of the wall in this box is really very shallow, but just enough to get this row of pots. And then the green kind of industrial lamp over the top, bamboo against the fence, all these things creating this offset, this foreground to the solid background, so that your eye basically virtually never finds the solid background. There's another bit of mirror in there. Now what this mirror in that kind of situation does is just throws light where you don't expect light. It's not that you want to look at point is not that you're seeing what's in the mirror, not that you're seeing yourself in the mirror or that you're seeing any planting in the mirror. It's just giving you a perception of light where actually a boundary wouldn't allow it. So it just has this fabulous sense of confounding where those boundaries sit. And then finally, I think another one of the multi-layered ways that this space is made to feel so much bigger and so much more engaging and interesting than a normal garden of this size is just through layer upon layer of collected items, bits and pieces that most of which are not particularly valuable, but that Steve has found over the years and have sitting in everywhere you look in this garden. There are things nestled in amongst it that very rarely dominate your viewpoint, but that your eye finds as it plays on the space. So in most cases, I think my eye goes straight to the center of the space, to the chairs or whatever the sitting space is, to the place that I would engage with it if I was sitting there. And then my eye wanders and finds all this other interesting stuff. And let's just take a look at some of the multiple interesting items that there are here. I'll just layer a whole lot on here. So there are distractions everywhere. And this is really powerful on this site, you know, you can load these up. Yeah, and you can overdo them. And I think this what's so good about this with Stephen's use of them is that there is, in most cases, there is a degree of subtlety. They are to some extent subsumed in the surroundings so that they're not yelling at you, but you find them. And in fact, even as I was shooting this, I was finding ones I hadn't seen before, just as I was training my eye to look for those things. So there's all those layers of detail. So I think this is an incredible garden. There is so much to learn here about maximizing your sense of space. One, creating subdivisions of smaller scale spaces. Don't be afraid to divide up an already small space. It can be overdone, it can be ineffectively done. So there are dangers, but don't be afraid of it. It will often be the greatest arrow in your quiver. The greatest tool in your toolbox is subdivision of an already smaller space. Don't be afraid to bring boundaries in, to bring walls and subdivisions within your boundaries, even though your boundaries already feel a bit too close. Maximize the use of glimpses through, of this idea of aperture, either through gateways or through windows, through fake ones if necessary, through mirrors, to give this sense that there's something beyond. Confounding the perception of your boundaries by simply giving your eye layers of things to see inside, just offset, just inside the boundary, is an incredible way of losing your perception of where the boundary actually is. And then just that layer and layer, that celebration of detail that you see in a garden like this. So there are just so many lessons to be learned from a garden like this. I think Stephen Wells' creativity seems to know absolutely no bounds. None of these things were particularly expensive. He's the great upvaluer, really, of a property like this. Was not in any way grand or glorious, but what he's done to upvalue it, and upvaluing pretty raw materials, building materials, and doing really interesting things with them. He's a genius at this, and I just can't wait to see what he goes on to next.